We read in Psalm 127, verse 4, as arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. The bow and arrow was one of the weapons used in warfare, but is often used allegorically as words spoken with the tongue, with the intention of doing harm to the soul. Okay, take for example, Psalm 64, verses 2 and 3, where we read, "Hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked, from the insurrection of the workers of iniquity, who whet their tongue like a sword and bend their bows to shoot their arrows, even bitter words." So the bitter words of the wicked are arrows intended to pierce through, like the fiery darts of the wicked, for example, over in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 16. Same idea. Above all, taking the shield of faith, wherewith ye shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked. Now, the tongue is just as deadly a weapon, if not more deadly, than an arrow shot out of a bow. For example, we read in Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 8, "The tongue is as an arrow shot out. It speaketh deceit. One speaketh peaceably to his neighbor with his mouth, but in heart he layeth his weight." And over in Psalm 57, verse 4, the tongue is likened to the sword, and their teeth are likened to arrows. "My soul is among lions, and I lie even among them that are set on fire, even the sons of men, whose teeth are spears and arrows, and their tongue a sharp sword." Now, friends, do not confuse this with the common lies and deception people use today with one another. This has little to do, if anything, with the crooked car salesman, for example, right? Trying to sell you a car that was in a wreck. This has everything to do with those bringing a false gospel, speaking falsehoods from the tongue, seeking to lead you astray from the truth and the truth of the gospel. Now, back in Psalm 64, in verses 7 and 8, the Lord shoots right back at them. Remember, this chapter started out with the enemy shooting at God and his people. We read in verse 7, "But God shall shoot at them with an arrow. Suddenly shall they be wounded. So they shall make their own tongue to fall upon themselves. All that see them shall flee away." Now, this statement is very curious, right? They shall make their own tongue to fall upon themselves. This reminds me of the language used of a soldier falling on his sword, right? Saul, King Saul, for example, fell on his sword in Mount Gilboa. Now, since the tongue is really what's in view, God is saying that they will perish by their own lies and falsehoods with which they sought to deceive the elect. In the case of King Ahab, one of my favorite stories, it was a quote unquote stray arrow that found its mark. You'll recall that Ahab was in the heat of a battle to reclaim Ramoth Gilead, which was one of the cities of refuge that had fallen into the hands of the enemy king of Syria. Well, Ahab would lose his life in this battle. We read in 1 Kings chapter 22, beginning in verse 34, "And a certain man drew a bow at a venture and smote the king of Israel between the joints of the harness. Wherefore he said unto the driver of his chariot, Turn thine hand and carry me out of the host, for I am wounded. And the battle increased that day, and the king was stayed up in his chariot against the Syrians and died at even. And the blood ran out of the wound into the midst of the chariot." You see, Ahab represents every one of us who make the flesh our armor, who put our hope and confidence in the flesh. Yet, even as the arrow found its mark, the sword over in Hebrews will find its mark. Same idea. Chapter 4, verse 12. "For the word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword." We might even say arrow. piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit and of the joints and marrow, and as a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. You see, it doesn't matter if it's a sword or arrow, it's all the same. Ahab thought he was well protected, right? But he had just a small chink in his armor. Who do you think guided that arrow to pierce him through? Well, I would say the same whose word is sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing through the joints and marrow of the flesh we put so much confidence in, the armor of our sin and the world. God will shoot the sharpest and deadliest arrow in his quiver, Christ himself. He will find those chinks in whatever armor we are trusting in. We read over in Isaiah chapter 49, verses 1 through 3, "Listen, O isles, unto me, and hearken ye people from far. The Lord hath called me from the womb. From the bowels of my mother hath he made mention of my name. And he hath made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand hath he hid me, and made me a polished shaft. In his quiver hath he hid me, and said unto me, Thou art my servant, O Israel, in whom I will be glorified." Now, this chapter goes on to talk about the one being described here as the Redeemer of Israel, a light to the Gentiles, and so on. And a sharp sword protrudes from his mouth, where the same imagery is seen in Revelation chapters 1 and 19, speaking of Christ. The original word for arrow is translated shaft here for some odd reason, but the phrase translated polished shaft literally should say pure arrow. Both the arrow and sword represent words spoken with the tongue. He is in the same quiver also of arrows with his sons, the body of believers, who are the arrows of his quiver. And we will come back to this in verse 5.